I love Luigi's Mansion isn't a statement that would shock anyone at this point. I already gave it a glowing review and spent half of the Dark Moon review talking about how it wasn't as good as the first game. But I also mentioned that I generally dislike handhelds, and especially handheld sequels to console games. Well, you could add on handheld remakes to things I dislike about handhelds. Early last year, during a Nintendo Direct, one game they announced was a 3DS remake of Luigi's Mansion. I wasn't very happy about that. It was one thing to make a sequel to one of my favorite games on the 3DS. It was another to remake that game for the 3DS. In general, I don't really like remakes, but to remake it on the 3DS was even worse. Now, I initially was just going to ignore this remake, but since I've done the original and Dark Moon, and I'm planning on covering the third game when that comes out, I thought, what the hell, I might as well do it for completion's sake. Just so we're clear here, this is a comparison between the original Gamecube version and this new 3DS remake, so if you're gonna complain about me comparing it too much, stop it. That's the point of this video. I already made a review for Luigi's Mansion, so I'm not going to repeat information unless it's necessary, which means I won't be going over the plot and stuff like that. Now, the thing that immediately stuck out with this remake was obviously the visuals. It was the main thing I complained about in my last video about it. The original Luigi's Mansion was such an impressive looking game. Being a launch title for the Gamecube, it liked to show off. It had an amazing atmosphere. The mansion had an almost realistic look to it that made it stand out in the Mario universe. Every bit of detail present added to the dark atmosphere, which gave this place a feeling of unease. The mansion was so detailed, it was a character itself. The visuals in this remake are overall worse, which detracts from the atmosphere. Now, obviously, this would be the case, since, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the 3DS is a weaker system than the Gamecube. But that's kind of a big issue. The textures are of lower quality, some of them are more pronounced than the original, while others are less pronounced. They added color in places that didn't need it. It's supposed to be a creepy, decrepit, haunted mansion. It didn't need more color. Why is there all this purple during the final boss? The lighting is worse. Luigi has this glow around him. It was there a bit in the original, but it's much more pronounced here. And there's this issue where when you enter a dark room from a lit room, the dark room will be lit for a moment. Also, look at the shadows in the projector room. In the original, the way the shadows worked made it a bit harder to tell exactly where the ghosts were, which was part of the challenge, but here, not so much. They also really went overboard in the backgrounds during the bosses. Yeah, they always had these trippy backgrounds, but again, they're brighter and more pronounced. Did Boolossus really need these bright purple lights? Yeah, the final boss already had this intense atmosphere with all this fire. Let's make it even more intense. Let's have some fire tornadoes. Actually, looking back at the original, there are fire tornadoes there, but I've never noticed them before because they aren't as pronounced as this remake. But hey, they fixed the shadow glitch in the phone room, so no more Hangman Luigi. That's something. It tries to replicate the lighting from the original, and it's almost there, but it falls a bit short. It's a shame since the lighting had a lot of emphasis in the original. What also had a lot of emphasis was the particle effects, which have been heavily toned down. There was dust everywhere in the original, but now hardly any dust shows up. Like, seriously, look at Luigi's feet. This game has a problem with toning some things down while overpronouncing other things. But the thing that bothers me the most about the visuals are the animations, especially on Luigi. So Luigi no longer has his unique model made for the original. Now I'm pretty sure it's his Dark Moon model, and it's not even as expressive as the original, and just looks awkward most of the time. Like, look at his walking animation when he has his light out. That is super awkward, and you constantly are going to be seeing it the entire game. It's a little better when his light is down, but it still exaggerates his movements a bit too much. However, everything else is toned down. Like when Luigi had his big freakouts in the original, his model stretched like this. But it doesn't do that anymore, and it looks so bad. Oh, and look at when he gets hit by a fake door. In the original, he gets flattened, but here... Like, why would they change that? Is there anyone who would say this is an improvement? The entire game, Luigi's animations just bothered me, which really took me out of it. And the worst part was during the ending. Like, I don't even know how to describe it, but when he's laughing at Mario, it looks so bad. The original scene is one I have a hard time sitting through with dry eyes, but here, the animations just make me laugh at it. I can't believe this game managed to ruin the ending like this, but there you go. But it's not just with Luigi. The ghosts, too. They move around a bit more when they appear, which is small, but it looks dumb most of the time. Also, the transparency effect isn't as pronounced as the original, which makes them look more solid. It's the most noticeable with the boos. They aren't as bad as the Dark Moon boos, but still. Their tongues hang out more, and they move slower in cutscenes. Like they hardly move, and it again makes it look awkward. You might not think it's a big deal, but to someone who loves the original as much as I do, yeah, I'm gonna be critical of a remake of it. Also, to those who had said that it would look better when it was on an actual 3DS rather than a bigger screen, well, yes, it will look a little better. It will look a little less pixelated, but that's it. It doesn't magically look exactly like the original when you do that. And look, this isn't about the graphical fidelity. Well, it kind of is, because of the less powerful hardware means the art direction takes a hit. But the point is, I'm not complaining that it isn't Ultra HD 4K. I didn't want any kind of remake. I don't want a remake that improves the graphics because it looks really good already. It doesn't need to be improved. I'd be just as critical of a Switch remake. I want a port that doesn't change the visuals, so people can experience the original as it is, rather than having the original replaced. Look, I'm a weirdo that unironically likes the way Nintendo 64 games look, so it's not about it not looking modern. It's about it looking worse than the original. Now, aside from the visuals, the thing that I also knew was going to be worse were the controls, and boy was I right. So the original Luigi's Mansion utilized 2 analog sticks. You use the C-stick for aiming, the poltergust, and flashlight. The base model 3DS only has a single circle pad. Yes, the new 3DS does indeed have a second circle pad. However, Luigi's Mansion is not exclusive to it, so the controls had to be made with the original model in mind. There is an option in the controls for the new model, and I suspect that the controls for that would be pretty much the same as the Gamecube version. However, I can't verify that as I don't have a new 3DS and wasn't about to get one as well as another capture card for a worse version of a game I already have. So we're sticking with the single circle pad controls. Now, I initially feared that this game would control like Dark Moon. It seemed like an obvious move to reuse that game's controls. However, it doesn't control like Dark Moon at all. They tried to stay true to how the original controlled, which is nice and all, but it really needs that second analog stick. Without it, you can't aim with the flashlight nearly as easily. It's not like Dark Moon where you push a button to look up. Instead, you hold B to enter an aiming mode. At this point, you can move the poltergust with motion controls. In order to look up or down, you need to tilt the entire 3DS. You are also able to do this when sucking and blowing. Now, this is just about as awkward as it sounds. It's hard to get it to point exactly where you need it to be. It's jittery, and it takes more effort to move the flashlight to a neutral position, which will lead to you getting hit by attacks that you otherwise would have been able to very easily counter in the Gamecube version. Now, this motion control aiming only goes up and down, not side to side. In the original, you can turn using the C-stick, which allowed you to aim without moving Luigi. At first, I thought you just couldn't turn at all in this remake. That is, until I found out that you used the D-pad to do that. The D-pad functions the same as the C-stick did, so you can aim in all directions without motion controls. But there are a couple problems with it. For one, obviously it's harder to be precise using a D-pad to aim rather than an analog stick. One tap and it goes full speed in that direction, which makes aiming projectiles a lot more cumbersome. Good lord, if you thought trying to shoot the moon when the original was awkward, this is a nightmare. They even have these sparks coming out of it to help aim, but it doesn't help at all. Look at this. Now, the other problem with using the D-pad to aim, look where it's positioned. Yeah, that means you can't move and aim at the same time, which is super awkward. All these things just makes playing the game awkward. Sure, you can still do everything you can in the original, but it's not as easy to do it. This makes combat encounters more annoying to deal with. Since the ghosts themselves haven't changed at all, you are at more of a disadvantage because you can't aim as reliably. Sometimes when trying to catch a ghost you might get cornered by a different ghost, and it might be better to let go of the ghost you were holding on to so you can stop the other one. However, when releasing a ghost mid-suction, your light will often be pointing straight up, making it harder to stun the other ghost. Now this probably did happen in the original, but in the original it was much easier to reorientate the flashlight. So you can take a lot of damage that should have been avoidable because of this. Not to mention Boolossus, it's much more awkward trying to freeze these boos when you can't aim and move at the same time. Now all this probably doesn't apply if you're using the new 3DS. But again, I don't have one, so I can't really talk about it. There are a couple other changes to the controls. The original, being a Gamecube game, has analog triggers to work with. Basically, depending on how much you push them down, could give you different results. For example, using the elements, you either just spray it around by pushing it part way, but if you push it all the way down, it will shoot out a big blast. The 3DS doesn't have analog triggers, so it can't do that. To do the big blast, you need to be holding L, then push A. This change isn't a big deal. You rarely are ever given a point where you're using the blasts of any help. Only time is Boolossus, and even then it's hard to aim. But in the original, for some reason during Boolossus, if you push the trigger down all the way, nothing will come out for a second, but the boos still react as if you were spraying at them. That doesn't happen here. And having a separate button for the blast makes it more reliable, since it makes it that you can't accidentally do it. So that's one thing about this version's controls that is better than the original. Too bad it was for something you rarely use anyway. One issue that's to do with the 3DS itself, rather than any changes to the controls, is the circle pad. The original was made with a normal analog stick in mind. To catch ghosts, you pull back with it, and to do more damage, you tap back repeatedly. And it worked well with an analog stick. It doesn't work quite as well with the circle pad. It's pretty easy for your thumb to slip off it while trying to catch ghosts, and you need to readjust often. It really doesn't help that the rubber on my circle pad keeps falling off. Played a bit too much Smash on it. All this makes controlling this game worse than the original. And this isn't a nitpick. Controls are arguably the most important part of any game. If there's a problem with the controls, it will be a constant issue throughout the entire game. Yes, you can adapt to it, but just because you can adapt to bad controls doesn't mean they stop being bad. Now, to say these controls are outright bad is an exaggeration. They are functional, and it's probably as good as it could have been given the system, but that really shows the problem with picking the 3DS for this game. The controls are a hurdle you need to get over in order to play this game. Now, that's not to say that because a game's controls might take some getting used to, that means that it controls badly. Jet Force Gemini is a game where the controls take a bit to get the hang of. It's a third-person shooter on the Nintendo 64, which also lacked a second analog stick, so they had to work around the hardware. The main difference is everything about Jet Force Gemini was built around how it controls. Luigi's Mansion was not built around the limitations of the 3DS, it was built around the versatility of the Gamecube controller. At least in Dark Moon, despite me not really enjoying the way that game controlled, it was still designed around how it controlled. The ghosts were not as aggressive because you weren't as mobile. But in this remake, your mobility is nerfed while the ghosts remain the same. That puts you at a disadvantage. And before you try to say, I don't like it because I suck at it, look at this. I know the original game. And even with worse controls, I can still pull off stuff like this. I'm pretty good at Luigi's Mansion if I do say so myself. So you can trust me when I say the controls are a problem. One last thing regarding the controls. So the way you stun ghosts is the same as the original, just shine your flashlight on them. But there's an option to use the Stroll Bulb from Dark Moon. In that game, to stun ghosts, you needed to charge the Stroll Bulb, then flash the ghosts. I was not a fan of this in Dark Moon, and I didn't like the idea of it being here. Now, it is a separate option you don't have to use, and the original method is the default one, so it's not like this takes anything away from the game, but I really question its inclusion. Okay, it's probably here for people who have only played Dark Moon, so they get something familiar to use. But this game was not designed with it in mind at all, and it shows. Now, in order to be completely fair to this, I did a full playthrough using the Stroll Bulb, and it was awkward as hell. Now, it doesn't affect portrait ghosts, boos, or bosses, since you don't use the flashlight against them. But against normal ghosts? Good lord. They just ripped this straight from Dark Moon without altering anything, and it doesn't work as well. There is no advantage to using it at all. Just like in Dark Moon, when you flash with it, you are locked in place for a moment, which was already a bit annoying in Dark Moon, but the ghosts were designed with that limitation in mind. Dark Moon's ghosts weren't as aggressive as the original, and since they didn't change how aggressive these ghosts are, it's kind of a big hindrance when you miss with the Stroll Bulb and are stuck in place for a full second, giving the ghost plenty of time to hit you. The way these ghosts were designed worked well with the ability to stun them with your light. Having to charge it up slows it down, and since you can't turn while charging unless you use the D-pad, that just makes it a lot more awkward, and it slows down the pace of combat. It also adds an extra step to a few ghosts. For the ghost guys, you need to suck off their mask before you can stun them. Now you need to take the mask off, then use the Stroll Bulb, instead of just pointing the light at them. Same with the ghosts protected by the elements. Also, one thing that can be helpful if there are a lot of ghosts around is for you to stun them, but not catch them to make them disappear so you can focus on the ones you want to get rid of first. You can't do that with the Stroll Bulb because they don't disappear when you stun them, so that just outright removes an extra tactic you had. I really don't see any benefit at all in using the Stroll Bulb. Well, okay, there is one. The Stroll Bulb is pretty useful when trying to catch speedy spirits, but only if you are unable to get them as soon as they spawn. If a speedy spirit gets away, it can be really difficult to catch them without them disappearing, since any bit of your light touching them can get rid of them. But with the Stroll Bulb, it's much safer, though it is still easier to catch them with the normal light as soon as they spawn because you need to take the half second to use the Stroll Bulb, and that's enough time for them to get away. But yeah, that's really the only thing that keeps the Stroll Bulb from being a completely useless feature. You can't just slap on an extra mechanic that the game was not designed for and expect it to work just fine. Now okay, it isn't horrible playing the game like this, you can do it, but it's a worse option, and I really don't know why anyone would use this. So with the visuals and controls out of the way, let's go over every other change that was made that I noticed. This is a mostly one-to-one remake, but there are some differences here. The start of the game is the same. You go in, Egad saves you from a ghost, and you go back to the lab for a plot dump and some training. And now it's time to start the game, and what's happening? Oh god, why?
Stop it now, turn it off, stop it, stop it!
I'm not even playing Dark Moon, but he won't stop calling me! So what's happening here is Egad from the future is calling because he wants to test an experiment. It's a green Luigi. That's really bloody redundant. It's called Gooigi. He created it. And apparently the best field test he could think of was sending it back in time to help Luigi during the events of the first game. The actual reason this happens is to give an in-game reason for the co-op feature. And this really bothers me for a few reasons. One, Egad is messing with the timeline to test a blob. What if that actively hinders Luigi or causes him to fail? But more importantly, why did a co-op feature need to be justified in the story? Plenty of other games have co-op and don't feel the need to explain why there's two Master Chiefs. Sure, it's nice when the second player is a different character that has significance to the story, but the game has to be made with that in mind. When you take a single player only game and add a co-op feature, and then try to put it in the story, it kinda messes with things a bit and takes away from it. The story of the first game was about Luigi overcoming his fears to save his brother. He did this by himself. It takes away from that when you add in, but also with the help of this blob thing. This scene didn't need to exist. It would have been better if it was like Dark Moon's multiplayer with different colored Luigis, and they didn't try to justify it. Then it would be obvious that it's not actually canon. Another issue is that this scene just forces itself here no matter what. It doesn't only appear when you select the co-op option, so even if you only play by yourself, you have to have this shoved in your face. And Gooigi just chills in the background of the lab, constantly reminding you of its existence. Egad also calls you yet again after you beat the game to see if you tested Gooigi. He does this every time. I'm unsure if he stops doing it if you actually play co-op, because I have not been able to play co-op. Now, I was planning on playing co-op with my sister for this, but she lost her 3DS. However, that doesn't even matter because we wouldn't have been able to do much anyways. So the 3DS has a feature with some games called Download Play, where you only need one copy of the game to play with multiple people because it downloads a portion of the game to those who don't have a copy. I was going to do this if she had found her 3DS, except I found out that you can only fight the bosses with Download Play. Which, okay, I shouldn't have expected to be able to play the entire game like this, since there are obviously restrictions. The whole game doesn't get downloaded to the other person. So I thought, maybe I'll play online. I'll look around a few Discord servers I'm on to see if anyone would be willing to play with me. And there is no online. It's local only. So in order to play this co-op mode, you need 2 people with a 3DS as well as a copy of the game, and they need to be close to each other. At this point, I shouldn't be surprised by a Nintendo game lacking online. But yeah, I'm unable to play this co-op mode, so that's all I can say on the matter. And that just makes Luigi's forced inclusion into the story even more annoying. But actually getting into the changes, there isn't a lot of big changes, at least in the normal mansion, but a bunch of small changes. So let's go over them. In the original, some rooms will lock themselves with these vines, which makes it so you can't leave the room before all the ghosts are caught. In here, every time that happens, with the exception of the twins room for some reason, you get a 2-second cutscene of the vines covering the door. Yeah, thanks for that. I really couldn't figure out that it had happened if you didn't focus on it, even though the door is always visible anyways, and it comes with a sound cue when it happens. Was this really necessary? What is gained from having this? Sure, it doesn't take that much time, but it gets annoying, and it really didn't need to be there. Also, speaking of vines, the area doors no longer have spiked vines on them, but it still makes the sound of them starting to disappear when approached. I don't know why this was changed. In the original, there were 3 heart sizes indicating how much health they gave you, but for some reason there's only 2 here. There's no medium size, and at first I thought they replaced all the 20 health with 50, but no, both 20 hearts and 50 hearts are the same size, which is visually confusing. If I'm low on health, what would make me think of this heart is more effective than this one? The 50 hearts were huge for a reason. I wonder what the benefit of this change was. One thing that was kind of annoying in the original was when picking up gems you get this animation. Now the animation is fine, the annoying part is while this happens, other money keeps moving, and money disappears after a while. Well, here they made it that time stops during this animation, so you don't have to risk money disappearing while picking up gems. Although for some reason after the animation is finished you are unable to move for a full second, which is annoying. Now money is still frozen in time even during this extra second you can't move, but you know what isn't? Other ghosts, so you can get unfair hits like this. One thing I noticed is in the graveyard, in the original when you examine this gravestone, 3 Mr. Bones appear. But here only 2 appear, with the third only appearing after you catch one of them. That was a bit odd since the ghost layouts everywhere else haven't changed, but I noticed a couple other times when this happened. In both the sealed room and the tea room, a bunch of ghosts spawn all at once, but here only 2 will spawn at once. Is it that the game can't handle that many ghosts at once? Well, that can't be right, since there can be more than 2 ghosts at a time. Not to mention it handles Boolosses just fine. Is it that it can't handle more than 2 spawning at once? But then in the artist studio it spawns 3 ghosts at a time, so that can't be it. Did they change that to make it easier? If that's the case, then it's dumb. Why keep everything else the same and just change that? These parts aren't even hard, so I don't see the need to do that if that's the case. Now, for the most part, the dialogue is exactly the same from what I've noticed. I've scanned most of the portrait ghosts and haven't noticed any changes, except for one extra bit added to the end of Novell, where he mentions he's sleepy. That's an added hint to how you expose his heart, which is wait until he yawns. And this is fine, it doesn't harm anything, and makes it a little more clear on what you need to do, without outright telling you exactly what you need to do. And it's the first portrait ghost. The only other place I noticed a change in dialogue was during the blackout. In the original, when Egad calls you in the phone room, he tells you about Uncle Grimly and that he tends to prefer rooms with mirrors. Now this is a little misleading. At this point, when you think of rooms with mirrors, you'd probably think of the mirror room. I mean, it has one giant mirror in it, it's the most prominent mirror in the game, but he is not there. He's actually in the wardrobe room. Now the mirror in this room isn't the thing that sticks out about this room compared to the other rooms. There have been other rooms with mirrors, so it's a bit of an odd hint to highlight the mirror. In the 3DS version, instead Egad says he prefers rooms with a mirror and clothes, which is a much more clear hint, again, without outright telling you exactly where he is, and it requires you to be paying attention to the environment. From what I can tell, the placement of money hasn't changed at all, with one exception. There's an extra emerald. I'm not sure why, I guess because it's green like Luigi. Should have been an extra ruby, but at least it wasn't a sapphire. But speaking of rubies, in this room, there is a ruby in this pot, but it doesn't seem to be there. At first I thought they removed it, which would have been a travesty, but looking into it, there seems to be a glitch that prevents it from spawning. I did manage to get it to appear. on my third playthrough. It seems like it will only appear after the lights are turned on. Here's a couple of small things. When a boo gets away and you enter the room, it zooms in on them. In the original, when a boo was in a vertical hallway and you were on the far end of it, they would stare at you and the zoom in wouldn't happen until you got close enough to it. It was kinda creepy seeing them waiting for you like that, and it added to the atmosphere. Here, as soon as you enter the hallway, it does the zoom in. Also boo related is during the loading transitions, you get this boo in the lower corner. Was that necessary? It kinda takes me out of it when something serious is happening, and then this shows up. I noticed that sound effects aren't as loud here, as in you can't hear them at all when you get far enough away. Like with these hallway ghosts you normally hear throughout the entire hallway. This also applies to certain things in rooms, like the fire in the dining room. You hear it the entire length of the room. But here, you can't hear it at all in the center of the room.
Mario!
Another place this affects is the room with the toy soldiers. It's similar to the conservatory where you need to inspect every instrument which adds it to the song, but with these music boxes. But on the 3DS, you can't hear all three of them at once because they are on opposite ends of the room.
Oh yeah!
How did they not notice this? While we're talking about music, a couple times the music is out of sync with the scene, like with the final boss. Come on, how did you mess this up? It was timed perfectly before. Speaking of Bowser, there are a couple annoyances here. For some reason, when you knock his head off, it takes a bit longer for King Boo to come out. That's annoying, and you can't move while it happens like in the original. What was the benefit of this? Also, apparently hearts can appear out of these pillars, and if your health was below 90 and you bring it back up like that, you still qualify for the gold rank. Kinda defeats the challenge a bit. Though it might be rare since it only happened once to me. I'm pretty sure it didn't happen in the original, though feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I do have vague memories of hearts coming out of those pillars in the original, but since I hadn't seen it in years, I figured I was just wrong about it. You might call some of these things nitpicks, and maybe they are. But so what? Just because an issue is small doesn't mean it's not valid to point out. Now, true, if you over-exaggerate a nitpick and make it out that it has greater effect on the game than it really does, then that's not good criticism. But pointing out small problems is valid, and they do make the overall experience worse, especially when they're added into a remake of a game that didn't have them in the first place. Take your favorite game, put in a bunch of small annoyances. Would you like that? Sure, it may not ruin the game, but it makes it a worse experience. Now we're on to the big changes. First up is the gallery. In the original, the gallery was just a place to look at the portrait ghosts you captured and see what rank you got. That's it. But here they changed it up quite a bit. First is the actual design of it. And despite me not liking the downgraded visuals of this game, I like this new layout of the gallery. You have a few floors with the portraits all facing you, while in the original most of them were on the walls of these hallways so you couldn't see them without examining them. But here you can see them at all times. You also have the ability to refight any of the portrait ghosts here. And if you didn't get the gold the first time, but managed to get it during the rematch, it actually counts so you don't need to constantly exit the game and restart if you're going for all golds, which is nice. There's also this pedestal that once you interact with it, it shows you a list of achievements. The more you get, the more the statue is completed. You can also access this list in the pause menu at all times. Yes, there are now achievements to get, which is fine, but it's weird how it's presented. So there are multiple tabs, and they're divided up by difficulty. The first is beginner, then easy, then normal, etc. But you can't see the next tab until you've completed the previous one, so I can't see the easy achievements until I clear all the beginner ones. But you can still work towards the ones in tabs that you can't see, as well as unlock them. You just won't know until you've unlocked the previous tabs. The last thing about this gallery is there's an extra room with 3 extra portraits that slowly fill in as you play. One lists all the normal ghosts you catch, as well as how many of each you've got. Another lists all the boos you get, not counting the 15 that make up boo losses, and the third shows the mansion ranks you can get, but only if you get them, which means to truly 100% this game, you need to play through it at least 9 times. Sometimes I hate being a completionist. And that's all there is to the gallery. It's a good change, nothing it adds takes away or gets in the way of the game. Although I almost forgot that for some reason the first time you go here, you need to find this part of the Game Boy Horror before you can even use it, which I don't know what the point of it is. But now for the biggest change, the Hidden Mansion. In the original, once you completed the game, you had the option to go to the Hidden Mansion. This was essentially a harder version of the game. However, in the US and Japanese versions, there was very minimal changes. You took more damage from ghosts, and your poltergeist did more damage to ghosts in return. That was all that was changed, and it was cool, but when compared to the PAL version, which got a lot more changes, it was kinda lame. I've always wanted to try this PAL Hidden Mansion, and this is the one thing that I thought would be good about this remake if they brought it back. This remake doesn't bring back the PAL Hidden Mansion, but it does have its own version. There were a lot of changes made for this Hidden Mansion. It does have some stuff from the PAL version, but it also has new things as well. Now, I have still yet to play the PAL version, but the original Luigi's Mansion is an easy game. The Hidden Mansion in the original is also easy, maybe even easier, because you do a lot more damage. But this Hidden Mansion is actually quite a challenge. Let's go over what was changed. So starting off, the mansion isn't mirrored like it is in the PAL version, which I don't care about. I've never really seen the point of mirroring a game as an extra challenge. It can be a bit disorienting at first, but it doesn't really make it harder. Right away you see the ghost layouts are different here. Normally in the first room there are only 3 gold ghosts, but here there's a gold ghost, a purple puncher, and a blue twirler. The blue twirlers normally don't show up until Area 4. Well, technically at the end of Area 3 with a variant that's protected by water, but the point is a late game ghost shows up in the first room. Ghosts also have more health and deal more damage, but I haven't noticed any increased power to the poltergeist. So the fact that ghosts have more health actually means something since it's not cancelled out by your own increased power. The second room had ghost mice around, which made it trickier to catch ghosts while making sure not to run into them. Took a bit of a beating here, but otherwise it was going well. But then I really knew I was in for it when in the third room, invisible grabbing ghosts appeared. They normally only appear in the mirror room, but them being here meant they could potentially appear in any room that has a mirror. Well, they don't actually appear all that often. In fact, I don't remember another instance where they appeared outside of the mirror room, which is a tad disappointing, but this was still a bit of an eye-opener. These first 3 rooms really show what kind of a challenge you're going to get out of these remixed ghost layouts. Another thing you may notice from these first 3 rooms, there aren't any hearts. You don't get any hearts from examining furniture, which means you can't heal yourself at all. Normally, I don't really care for these extra difficulty modes Nintendo likes to add to re-releases like Hero Mode in Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD, where the main difficulty comes from there not being any hearts to heal yourself with. It doesn't really make it much harder, it just forces you to just go back to a place that has a healing potion or find a fairy. But I'm fine with it here because refilling your health is tied to your own skill. The only way to get health back is by catching ghosts. Not just catching ghosts, catching at least 2 at a time. You have to take risks to get that reward. Catching multiple ghosts at once is now more important than it's ever been, since it's the only way you will stay alive. At least until you find out you can just leave. Yeah, you can just leave the mansion now through the front door and go back to the lab. And if you come back, your health is fully restored. Well, there goes the challenge of managing your health and setting ghosts up to be caught 2 at once. I didn't find out until later in the game, but still, it's way too tempting to just leave the mansion if your health gets low once you know about this. But leaving Area 1, the challenge continues. Right away, these exploding ghosts appear here, fish ghosts can be in normal rooms, and more challenging arrangements of ghosts start showing up. I almost died in the first bathroom. Not every room has changed though. Some, like the kitchen and the graveyard, are the same, and some have changes that don't really make it much harder. Like the hidden room has ghost guys instead of flashes, which is different but not all that difficult. But man, some of these rooms are really tough. Like the tea room. In the normal mansion, there's only 2 grabbing ghosts here, that's it. But in the hidden mansion, there are so many ghosts. Not just grabbing ghosts, there were ghost guys, flashes, even blue twirlers. They just wouldn't stop coming. It got to the point I started using fire strategically, and not just for the flashes, and even then I nearly died. I made it out with 2 HP, and this is before I knew I could just leave the mansion to restore my health, so I actually died in the Astral Hall. I actually died in Luigi's mansion. You gotta understand something. I've played the original countless times. The game isn't very hard as it is, but combine that with me being very familiar with it, and it's been a long time since I've even had my health go down past 60, let alone actually die. So when I actually, legitimately, had a tough time surviving at multiple points here, it was rather refreshing. A game I've already played to death had given me a new challenge. For the most part, I'd say this challenge is a fair one. Some rooms feel a bit cheap, like the tea room as previously mentioned, and the safari room since they throw a lot at you. But because of that, I found it to be very satisfying to overcome them. Now I don't know how much this differs from the PAL version. I know they have some similarities, but also aren't exactly the same. The layouts I know for sure are the same is the first room and the artist studio where 5 ghosts appear at once instead of 3, which really shows that having more than 2 ghosts spawn at once wasn't a problem. But whether or not the rest of the rooms are the same or different, I'm not too sure on. Now, ghost layouts aren't the only things changed here. Some item placements are different. The location of gold mice is the same, which is a bit odd since the speedy spirits are in different places. As someone who had the speedy spirit locations memorized, it was quite refreshing to not know when they'd appear. And it was a surprise and pretty satisfying when examining something and actually finding one. And even more so during the blackout. There are 3 speedy spirits that only appear during the blackout. Now, I never found these on my own originally. I saw other playthroughs that pointed it out, so I felt like it would be cool for me to hunt these 3 down without knowing where they were. Which, given that you can't save at all during the blackout, and how you can't recover health as easily, it was quite the intimidating task. But I found them. One was in the mirror room, another was in the tea room, and the last was in the twins room. That last one is a bit weird because in the normal mansion there's a speedy spirit in the same place. But it was nice hunting them down, even if I did die once in the process. Although speaking of speedy spirits, in the PAL version, they as well as gold mice would give you a diamond, which greatly increased the amount of money you can get. But they don't do that here. There doesn't seem to be much of an increase to the total amount of money. There is one thing that gives you a bit more money, but I'll get to that in a bit. It's a bit odd that there isn't much of an increase when the hidden mansion is the only way to get an S rank. Guess that means you have to work harder to get it. So one more thing that was changed. Mario's dropped items are also in different places. You can imagine my shock when I didn't get the hat in the washing machine. Now this is kinda cool, but also a bit pointless since it only really affects 2 of them. The hat and letter because you get them out of examining objects. The shoe and glove are in chests from rooms you clear, so you can't really miss them if you clear every room. And where these are placed is a bit weird. So the shoe is now in the billiards room, but the billiards room is right next to the projector room, which normally has the glove. The glove is now in the backyard, which normally has the letter in it. The letter is now in the twins room, which normally has the shoe. And the star hasn't even changed locations at all, which is a bit underwhelming. The hat is the only one in a location far away from the others. It's in the kitchen. So I have to ask what the point of it was if it's still mostly the same rooms you get them in. Surely there are better places you could have hidden these. There are also minor adjustments to boos and portrait ghosts. They both have more health. The boos might be a bit harder to catch, I don't know for sure. A couple early boos managed to get away when I usually don't have any problems getting them, but that might just be a result of the added health. The portrait ghosts now have 150 health, and that includes the first 2 bosses. And with this increased amount of health comes a new rank. If you manage to shave off 140 of their health, you can now get a platinum rank. Other than that, nothing has changed. And with the bosses, getting a platinum is the same as getting a gold. The bosses are hardly changed. Chauncey's rocking horses are bigger and move side to side like in the PAL version, and Bogmire now disappears really quickly, making it a lot harder to hit him. But Boolossus and King Boo don't seem to have any differences. You don't ride on the Poltergust during Boo losses like in the PAL version, and the only thing added to King Boo was 750 health. But that's pretty much it for the Hidden Mansion. I really like this Hidden Mansion. However, there is still a problem. In order to play this Hidden Mansion, I have to put up with a worse version of this game. I have to deal with the worse visuals, worse atmosphere, worse animations, and most importantly, I have to put up with all the control issues. Good lord, I can't imagine trying to play this with a Stroll Bulb. What this means is that there's no longer a definitive version of Luigi's Mansion, and that's another issue I have with remakes, especially remakes on worse hardware. They have to dumb down the game to work on the hardware, but to compensate, they add in some new stuff. But that just makes you want the new stuff in the overall better version of the game. It's like Hyrule Warriors Legends all over again. You have the Wii U version, but then they port it to the 3DS, which obviously can't handle the game as is, so you get a worse frame rate and less enemies on screen at once. But to make it worth it, they add new content that isn't in the Wii U version, so if you wanted to play the new maps, you had to get an inferior version. At least they fixed this issue with the Switch version, but there is not a Switch version of Luigi's Mansion. Now, funnily enough, I ended up enjoying this remake more than Dark Moon. But that's just because I like the original more than Dark Moon. And this is still fundamentally Luigi's Mansion, but it's a worse version of it. And I have to say that I think Dark Moon is better than this remake. Because at least Dark Moon was its own thing with its own ideas, and its mechanics were designed with its own controls in mind, while this remake is just a worse version of the original. It tried to take a game and put it on a system it was not designed to work with, which makes playing it a worse experience. Plus, it just looks worse. With Dark Moon, it had its own style and personality, and it had fun with it. And even though I prefer the style of the original, I can still appreciate it on its own. When I look at this remake, all I see is a downgrade of the original. Now sure, as a 3DS remake of Luigi's Mansion, it does its job. It's about as good as it could have been. It's just, as good as it could have been, is still worse than the original in nearly every way. It does have some things in it that are good, or even slightly better than the original, but none of it is enough to outweigh the issues it added, as well as the worse visuals. And since the original isn't available, it effectively replaces it, and I'm not okay with that. As I mentioned before, I don't want a remake or remaster at all. I want the original, as it is, to be made available. The only change I want is the new Hidden Mansion, but that's it. It doesn't need a remake. It's already a fantastic game. Honestly, I can't stand this obsession people have with wanting remakes of games. It's like people can't seem to appreciate a game if the graphics aren't modern. Doesn't matter how good it is, or how impressive the graphics were at the time, or even if that impressive tech is a big part of its identity, and remaking it only serves to remove that identity. We gotta have them remakes. But that's a discussion for another time. With all that said, can I recommend this remake? If you've already played Luigi's Mansion, then only if you really want to experience this new Hidden Mansion, and only if you have a new 3DS. If you haven't played the original, then I recommend playing the original. If you don't have a Gamecube, well, you should get one. That thing has a lot of great games on it. But if you don't want to, then you can emulate the original. If you are unable to emulate it, and you literally have no other option but this remake, then I guess go ahead. It is still Luigi's Mansion at the end of the day, but I feel like you're doing a disservice to yourself and the original game. But that's all I have to say. I've got some big plans coming up next. They take a while to make, and I apologize in advance if that's the case, but I hope you look forward to it. I'll see you there.